Hello and welcome to Novara Live. I'm Dalia Gebrial and today I am joined by Kieran Andrieu. Kieran, how are you doing?
Dalia, yes, I'm doing very well. And do you know what? I can't believe that this is the first time that I'm co-hosting with you in all this time. So it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Good to see you too. So coming up tonight, we've got a really jam-packed show for you. Keir Starmer has announced a new plan to send asylum seekers overseas. We asked economist Faiza Shaheen whether UK growth will translate to rising living standards for ordinary people. Spoiler, it won't. And Ben of Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream has been arrested for protesting in the US Capitol. Stay tuned for all of that and more. And as ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. It's Nakba Day, the anniversary of the Palestinian catastrophe when the people of the land now called Israel were violently displaced, ethnically cleansed and dispossessed of all they owned by Zionists. That process that began 77 years ago continues today in Gaza and the illegally occupied Palestinian territories as the state of Israel leverages its full military power, funded and supplied by the US, UK and other Western states, to erase the peoplehood, the culture, the hopes and the political ambitions of Palestinians. Of course, Palestinians have never surrendered to that overwhelming force. The history of Palestinian persecution is also the history of Palestinian resistance, both in Palestine and amongst the global Palestinian diaspora. Their opposition, political, military, and civilian, to domination and erasure has inspired millions across the world to engage in their own struggle against imperialism, oppression, and injustice. That struggle continues in Gaza today as Israel conducted a second night of intense air raids across the enclave overnight, killing over 100 Palestinians, according to Gaza's Civil Defense Authority. Twins Muaz and Mu'taz al-Bayouk were killed by an Israeli bomb that struck their home in Khan Yunis on Wednesday night. These men are taking the bodies to the twins' mother. She was also injured in the attack and was taken to the Nasser hospital, where she learned of the deaths of her children. 13-year-old Reem al-Zanati was asleep at home when her uncle's house next door was hit by a missile last night, with the blast causing her home to collapse too. She survived, but her uncle, her aunt, and all her cousins were killed. Describing the moment she woke up to the blasts, she told Reuters this: "We didn't feel or hear anything until we woke up with rubble on us. I always used to dream I would be under rubble. So this time I found rubble on me. And when I moved, I found myself really under the rubble. The civil defense did not come. I will tell you honestly, we pulled ourselves. My father helped us to come out from under the rubble." That attack on Khan Yunis, which reportedly targeted homes as well as tents and other temporary accommodation, killed 56 Palestinians and injured more than 60 others, according to officials. In the Gebrial refugee camp in northern Gaza, missiles struck a building in the Tal al-Zatar neighborhood, causing panic amongst the Palestinians still left in the area. Now, we can't verify whether this is the same strike, but there are also reports that a charity clinic and prayer hall were bombed in Gebrial, killing 13 people. The area around the Indonesia hospital in Gebrial was also attacked, echoing the attack on the European hospital in Khan Yunis earlier this week. In Gaza City, more Israeli violence has yet to come. An evacuation order, one of the largest issued by Israel since the start of the genocide, has ordered Palestinians to flee shelters in the west and northern parts of the city ahead of what the Israeli military has called intense strikes. Areas to be targeted include several schools across the city, the Islamic University, and the Shifa Medical Complex. Medical staff have said they will not abandon their patients. Agency workers say the sites are sheltering thousands of displaced Palestinians, though Israel alleges they are being used as Hamas control and command centers. Now, we've all heard that many times before, including yesterday when the Israeli military used that claim to justify an attack on the European hospital in Khan Yunis. This was the moment an Israeli bomb, identified by the BBC as a heavy ordnance bunker buster bomb, struck the courtyard of the hospital and leaving behind a large flaming crater. Afterwards, the Israeli military put out this video claiming to show the presence of Hamas tunnels in the hospital. As we pointed out in yesterday's show, the video doesn't even show the European hospital, but rather a school several hundred meters away. And Sky News' own experts have said that even the claim that there are tunnels in that building are false, a conclusion Sky put to Israel's ambassador to the UN last night.
I just want to tell you what our experts have told us. Those tunnels that you're talking about, the dark shapes highlighted there on the screen, the markings were caused by water, not tunnels, because these are drainage systems. And so the dark shades that you're talking about, which Israel claims to be tunnels, are in fact caused by water because of a drainage system.
Well, I'm not familiar with your experts, but I can tell you that, Yilda, that today in Gaza, you have an underground system bigger than the tube in London and the subway in New York City combined. It's a huge infrastructure of tunnels.
Ambassador, so can I confirm that the video that the IDF has put out to say was the European hospital and that there was a tunnel system under there was in fact wrong?
Absolutely not. I told you earlier, we checked it and we saw tunnels that started in the hospital and went to other areas in the surrounding area of the hospital.
Well, our experts say that this is in fact the courtyard of a school and not a command and control center. And like I said, those tunnels that you point to are in fact the dark marks were caused by water because of a drainage system. So would you say then and admit that this was in fact a mistake by the IDF?
Absolutely not. And I think we will be able to confirm, some of the individuals who we were able to eliminate in this operation. And you will ask yourself, it was like a school, why you have leaders of the Hamas terrorist organization hiding beneath a school, beneath a hospital. They're taking advantage of those places, but we are determined to hunt them down everywhere.
I'm sorry, you're not answering my question. The footage put out by the IDF, they claimed that it was the tunnel and command and control center underneath the European hospital. The footage, in fact, is of a school. Did the IDF put out the wrong footage or they got it wrong?
No, so I answered you. Maybe you are not happy with the answer I'm giving you.
Maybe the reason she's not happy with the answer you're giving is because she is showing quite concrete evidence that what you labeled as a tunnel is in fact a drainage system. And your response to that is, nah, it isn't. And all you've got is my word, a word that is on a almost historic level at this point, deeply unreliable. And also another thing that I noticed there that I'm sure, we're all familiar with this now, even though that interview was quite insistent and, she didn't take his initial answers, she got what she could out of him, but it was good to see some of that concrete evidence being put to an Israeli official and sort of not letting it go. But still, you notice in the banner, it says, dozens killed by strike. And it's just, again, this inability to name the perpetrator. And when you don't name the perpetrator, you are giving the green light for that perpetrator to continue because it's a way of skirting all accountability to the people who we know are doing this, who we know are bombing schools for having drainage systems. As the US President, Donald Trump, tours the Middle East, he's been airing new plans for Gaza's future. In Qatar, Trump has now called for Gaza to be turned into a freedom zone, following Israel's refusal to consider a ceasefire. The president said this: Gaza has been a territory of death and destruction for many years. I have concepts for Gaza that I think are very good. Make it a freedom zone. Let the United States get involved and make it just a freedom zone. There's practically no building standing. It's not like you're trying to save something. There's so many things that are disgusting about that statement. First of all, Gaza has been a territory of death and destruction for many years. This is an area that has been undergoing what the Supreme Court considers a plausible risk of genocide, done with with weaponry and political cover that Trump himself has signed off on. And so this idea that it has just been a territory of death and destruction out of nowhere is absurd. It's been a territory of death and destruction precisely because of the involvement of states like the US. Also, before that, it was basically an open-air prison. Gaza has been under siege for a very long time. And then he says, make it a freedom zone. First of all, the people of Gaza have been fighting for their freedom and for their sovereignty for a very, very long time. Many of the ideas of freedom, of true freedom, that we can think of have emerged from people who have undergone imperialism in this explicit way. And then saying there's practically no building standing. It's not like you're trying to save something. Sorry, but these are people's lives and communities and a place that they have built that, yes, has been destroyed. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing there worth saving. It's just, it's the kind of the clarion call of imperialism is before you go full board and, you invade a place and you totally colonize it, you call it terra nullius. You say that there is nothing here worth saving. There's no people, there's no life, there's no, there's nothing there worth saving. That is what you do right before you engage in explicit colonialism. Now, obviously, colonialism is what has been taking place in this area for a very long time. But it just when I read that, I was like, oh, he's doing the terra nullius thing, like old school British European imperialism at this point. Now, obviously, nobody in Gaza is interested in that idea, but it also seems that those in Israel are less and less interested in it too. The country's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has been increasingly vocal about taking new territory in the Strip, ordering the call-up of thousands of reserves ahead of a new ground offensive. And analysis by the New York Times has now shown that the Israeli military has been making advances on Rafah under the cover of the starvation Israel has been inflicting on Palestinians in the Strip for months. Satellite imagery analysis shows that Israel has flattened large sections of the southern city of Rafah in the last few weeks. So that's the area in orange. And then the areas in yellow are those that were bombed over the previous 18 months. And they've also discovered that Israel has built a new road from the Israeli border towards Gaza's coast. And presumably that's the route through which further military forces will enter the Strip as Netanyahu's intensive escalation, as he calls it, continues. Kieran, what is the significance of this taking place on Nakba Day?
Well, usually, Dalia, I make copious notes for all of our segments. And actually, I haven't written a damn thing today. Not on this, at least. My family were in the Nakba. My family are from East Jerusalem, Palestinians from East Jerusalem. And if they had been told 7 years ago that this would still be going on and would be far worse than anything since 1948, I think that they would have struggled very seriously with that. But that is what has come to pass. That's what's happened. And yet, in spite of all that suffering and in spite of 7 years of repetitious trauma, injustice, murder, massacre, etc., culminating, of course, latterly in what is beyond description, beyond words, in Gaza with a genocide. In spite of all of that, we're still here. In spite of all that, Palestinians are now more visible to the entire world, more known to the entire world than at any point in that 77 years history. And that's really quite something. I don't think it's insignificant at all. The level of suffering that has been needed for that to be the case is obviously unspeakable and appalling. But we're not going anywhere. I mean, we're not going anywhere. That's the headline for Israel, right? Israel could do whatever it wants to the Palestinians. The international community has shown that in plain relief, in technicolor. It can do whatever it wants to us. And nobody, at a state level at least, will intervene. And yet, international civil society has swollen up from underneath and is part of the international solidarity movement, obviously started by Palestinians most courageously. And I think that despite Israel getting virtually everything it has wanted until this point in time, one thing it hasn't achieved, which it dearly, dearly wanted to achieve, two things. One, for nobody to know that the Palestinians ever existed. Well, it's completely and signally failed on that front. Everybody knows we exist. And in their legions, in their millions, perhaps in their billions, people are committed to Palestinian justice. So Israel's failed on that. It didn't manage to invisibilize us. It didn't manage to disappear or vanish us from history. And number two, Israel, it wasn't good enough for Israel to just be a colonial state, which is, of course, at its heart and in its marrow, what it's always been. Israel wanted to be a romantic place. It wanted to be a place that conjured romance in the imagination and the hearts of the world. And actually, it was bloody successful in that con until the 1970s, 1980s. Gradually, that has mercifully, and in no small part thanks to Palestinian efforts, faded away. So Israel has lost very seriously on those two fronts. And those are the two things that I personally have to cling to find solace in what is, without doubt, the darkest episode in Palestinian history. I mean, I don't want to sound glib, but it eclipses the Nakba. Where we are now eclipses the Nakba. You just have to look at the numbers. And as I say, the headline for Israel is this: we're not going anywhere. Even if Israel uproots every last Palestinian from Gaza and from the West Bank and from East Jerusalem, and it manages, which it won't, by the way, but if it manages to clear all of us out of that territory and create for itself a temporary greater Israel, Palestinians aren't going anywhere beyond that. We'll be waiting, we'll be watching, and we'll be plotting.
I mean, I think the way in which Israel has, in the long-term sense, overplayed its hand in terms of the global story of what they have wanted to call a conflict, I don't think that can be overstated. I think, one thing that people who talk to me in the street, friends I have who maybe couldn't have found Palestine on a map a few years ago will say to me, like, the last 19 months has changed my life. It has not only made me deeply committed to the Palestinian cause, it has not only made me feel deeply invested in the Palestinian cause, but it has also shone a light and created a clarity in my understanding of imperialism, of what the British state, what the American state, how it orders the world, the violence with which it orders the world. I think it's shattered a lot of illusions. And I don't think that that's what Israel thought was going to happen the day after the 7th of October when they began their a re-escalation of their military siege in Palestine. And yeah, as you said, that is due to the steadfastness that is demonstrated by Palestinians in Palestine and beyond. After Prime Minister Keir Starmer's big immigration speech earlier this week, the one where he literally lifted a line from Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, Keir Starmer has made this announcement.
Yes, we are in talks with a number of countries about return hubs, and I see them as a really important innovation, and that is consistent with the work that we've done in relation to UK-Albania reduction in numbers, the work that we've done on law enforcement arrangements with other countries, the return agreements that we've put in place, the record number of returns. And what I'd like to do is add return hubs to that. We are in those talks, and therefore, at the appropriate time, I'll be able to give you further details in relation to it.
Starmer there was speaking from Albania, though the country's government has said it isn't taking part in those talks. But the BBC has previously reported that Starmer's return hub plan is mostly focused on the Balkans, an area including countries like Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. So what is a return hub? The plans are pretty vague at the moment, but the government says they would be used to house people whose asylum claims have failed prior to returning them to their countries of origin. But in that case, why deport them to a third country first? The Prime Minister's spokesperson gave this line of reasoning. This will basically apply to people who have exhausted all legal routes to remain in the UK but are attempting to stall using various tactics, whether it's losing their paperwork or using other tactics to frustrate their removal. It will ensure that they don't have the chance to make their removal harder by using tactics such as starting a family, etc., as we have seen from cases in the past. That obviously will reduce the cost to the taxpayer. Well, that might be some of the reason, but with reform eclipsing the Labour Party amongst its traditional voters, Starmer's Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, is probably also betting on the optics of cruelty being a vote winner. Although, of course, as we know, on the doorstep in the local elections, the thing that people in those Labour heartlands were most concerned about were cost of living, winter fuel payments, these disability cuts. But Keir Starmer doesn't want to touch that at the moment. He'd rather stoke up a moral panic on immigration as an easy way out. But Italy does have a similar scheme to this, but its use of the hubs has been largely blocked by legal challenges. The Labour iteration of various right-wing deportation schemes is likely to be just as performative and just as likely to fail at the first hurdle. Now, some are comparing this scheme to the Tories' outrageously cruel Rwanda scheme. That plan involved sending all asylum seekers who arrived in the country irregularly to Rwanda, where their claims would be processed. And if a claim failed, the asylum seeker would be returned. And if it succeeded, they'd be left to start a new life in the small African country. It was a disaster, repeatedly blocked by British judges and the European Court of Human Rights. But some people just can't let it go. This was Tory Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp speaking to GB News.
The last government did take action, for example, returns agreements with countries like Albania. So in 2023, our last full year in office, the number of illegal immigrants crossing the Channel actually went down by a third. But because Keir Starmer cancelled the Rwanda deterrent before it even started, on his watch numbers are up by 30%, and this year so far, 2025, has been the worst year in history for illegal immigrants crossing the Channel, because most illegal immigrants crossing the Channel are from nationalities where they will get their asylum claim granted because the laws are so soft. We think they need to be tougher, so they're never going to end up in these return hubs. So it simply won't work. It is a con on the British public.
Most illegal immigrants will have their asylum claim granted because they come from a country where there is good reason that, they're fleeing war, they're fleeing persecution, etc. That's such a funny sentence, isn't it? Because first of all, it's not illegal to claim asylum. That's just, so you're not an illegal immigrant if you have arrived in a country and you're claiming asylum. Second of all, if you're saying, well, the problem here is that the people who are coming over, they're getting their asylum applications granted. Yeah, maybe because they're seeking asylum. So what you're not trying to crack down on this, nefarious thing that you call illegal immigration. You're actually just trying to close down our refugee settlement system, which, by the way, is a system that emerged in the post-war era because of how countries like Britain treated Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. Because the door was shut on so many Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, we came up with a refugee convention in order to say that everyone who seeks asylum has a right to hear their claim heard. That's the legacy that the Tories were trying to roll back on, and that Starmer is now doing a pale imitation of that rollback. Kieran, what do you make of Starmer coming out of the local elections where it was clear that it was the economy stupid, and yet still banging on about these pretty flimsy, largely optics-based anti-immigration gestures?
Yeah, I think you struck the nail on the head when you said about the optics of cruelty, performative cruelty. And you're quite right to highlight the fact that actually it's the economy stupid. But just as it's the economy stupid, Keir Starmer has, we've talked about this many times on Novara, he, Rachel Reeves, others have put themselves into a straitjacket around the economy. Now, who knows whether it's just that they suffer from chronic lack of ambition or imagination or whatever. Something's gone on there, and none of them are willing to do anything remotely to meet the challenges of UK economic and social decline in the 21st century, in 2025. The big structural issues that need to be addressed. the relatively smaller cash payment type things that could have been introduced immediately or early on to relieve the suffering of people in this country at the sharpest end of the economy, totally unwilling to grasp the nettle. And so what Keir Starmer does instead, what he does by rote by now, is he appeals to the politics of cruelty, the optics, etc., etc. It's completely ill-conceived for the reasons you've given, which is that actually, time after time after time, polling data shows that while immigration and, of course, the asylum stuff rides side saddle with that, nonetheless, the far more important for most people on the doorstep and in polling and so on is the bread and butter things. The bread and butter things like being able to pay your bill, having security in your job, having security in your home, etc., etc. Again, those are the things that Keir Starmer is signally incapable of dealing with or unwilling to deal with. Keir Starmer thinks that he's doing a Faustian pact. He thinks he's doing a deal with the devil. That's what he thinks he's doing. He does the deal with the devil, and in return, the devil will give him electoral success. Even from that highly immoral, highly utilitarian standpoint, it's completely and utterly flawed, because the anti-immigration crowd hated Keir Starmer before he came through the door. They hated him at hello. The rest of us hate him because he, well, take your pick, enables genocide. He beats on the most vulnerable in society, not least asylum seekers, but also the disabled, poor people, unwilling to help poorer and lower middle class and middle class people in this country. And also add to that he's a congenital liar. I mean, he's a bald-faced congenital liar. We all, those of us who think immigration is a positive thing, we all hate him for those reasons. And the other guys hate him inherently. So, I mean, he's never been good at coalition arithmetic. And that's obvious. But I think this is a new level of incompetence. And it's it's not actually a new low morally, because he sort of wades around in the sewer with this kind of stuff very, very regularly. But it is a new tone. There's a new tone of rhetoric around it. It's the oldest and the meanest trick in the book. I mean, we could go on about this till we're blue in the face. Kick the most vulnerable in society. Who are the most vulnerable in society? Well, of course, asylum seekers are among the most very vulnerable in the whole world. For exactly the reasons that you've given, Dalia. They're fleeing persecution, war, etc. And on that point, just to end on this, Aaron, our own Aaron, has made this point on a news show. I've made this point on the same news show. If people really do want to reduce the numbers of asylum seekers don't want to leave their homes. They don't want to, despite what certain sectors of British public opinion thinks that, and certain politicians, I might add, that this is the land of milk and honey, and they just want to come here and exploit our resources and our way of life. It's utter nonsense. Most or all asylum seekers want to stay in their homes. And the reason that they don't is because they're being bombed. And that's relevant because four of the top 5 countries that are producing people in the small boats today and for the past 2-3 years have been countries that we've either bombed or that we've whacked punishing sanctions on. So Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and of course with the sanctions, Iran. So maybe try bombing a few fewer countries. Maybe try not grandstanding about war all the time, as you see Keir Starmer pathetically scurrying towards in the particular case of Ukraine and Russia, to try and bolster his own electoral standing. And politicians have done that. David Cameron did it in Libya, which is also on the list, by the way. Iraq, we all know about that. Syria, we know about that as well. Afghanistan, we know about that. It's not a correlation. There's a causal relationship between our foreign misadventures and the very serious destruction that they cause to life, to infrastructure, to countries, and people needing to seek asylum in the first place.
Absolutely. Tackle the root causes of forced displacement. And that's what people who are seeking refuge, people who seek asylum, it's more often than not forced displacement. But that's not the conversation that the political elite want to have, because they can't confront those contradictory and difficult economic questions. They don't have the imagination, they don't have the political will, they don't have the chops for it. And so the easy way out is to kind of join this anti-migrant furor that we have been under now for decades, but obviously it has escalated in the past 10 years. And I think that question about the strategic value of this is really important. I mean, for me, I'm a bleeding heart, lefty. Like, I just find the dehumanization of migrants and refugees horrific and unforgivable just on its own basis. But even if you're looking at it, as you said, with this really kind of cold lens, I can't deny that there is a significant section of the British public, or not even a significant section, let's just say a section of the British public that have been radicalized into a doggedly anti-immigration position where, immigration is they are single issue voters and immigration is the issue that they are going to vote on. They are not voting for Labour. They are going to vote for reform. They're going to vote for the Tories because that has been, especially in this election coming up, Reform is basically a single issue party around immigration. The other stuff is kind of by the by. They don't have really developed policies in other areas. They barely have a developed immigration policy, but that is their main character, as it were, of their vision for a future Britain. And so there is this huge mass of people who maybe they do, not like immigration, or maybe they don't, they do want to see changes at the border. But that might not be the thing that's going to push them to the polls or pull them towards a particular party. They are movable on other issues. And yet it's the inability to address those other issues that I would argue, if we're going to talk about an island of strangers, if we're going to talk about the alienation, the deep alienation that people are feeling, the things that are really causing that, the gobbling up of public space by corporations, the fact that you can't go anywhere anymore without having to buy something, the fact that, we're at least in big cities, which are full of renters, where you're having to move every few years. You can't settle down. You can't make roots. If you don't come from a big city, there's not enough economic opportunity where you are to be able to stay in your hometown where you might want to stay. Not everyone wants to move to a big city. Some people want to stay and live near their family, live near their childhood friends. People have to scatter. When we're talking about the actual spiritual and material things that are in crisis right now, there's so much avenue there to build a coalition around those things. And instead, you're setting yourself up to build yourself a coalition around, the bare bones of a coalition around something that ultimately is not actually going to. I really don't think that even those people who just don't like immigrants, I don't think they're going to be as happy as they think they're going to be if the border's shut, which they never can because this country relies on migrant labor. So it's a stunning lack of imagination. It's a stunning lack of political will, but it's also an indication of the fact that Starmer and the people around him are short-sighted opportunists. They're not political visionaries. They're not people who are committed to particular principles. They are short-sighted opportunists who want to go wherever the wind is going. They don't have it in them to, create a wave. They can just ride the wave that Nigel Farage has created. And that's going to lead to Prime Minister Nigel Farage. The UK economy has grown more than expected over the last 3 months, according to new figures. The Office for National Statistics announced a growth in GDP of 0.7% in the first quarter of 2025, exceeding previous predictions of 0.6%. So that's an overperformance of 0.1%. That means the UK was the fastest growing G7 member between January and March, with other countries like France, Germany, and Canada seeing a bump of between 0.1 and 0.4%. Additionally, GDP per capita, which measures the average economic output per person rather than just the total national economic output, also rose by 0.5%, the highest in the past year. Now, understandably, Chancellor Rachel Reeves has been keen to bask in what is a rare good headline for her economic programme so far. Responding to the figures, she said this: Up against a backdrop of global uncertainty, we are making the right choices now in the national interest. So that uncertainty, of course, refers to the global trade war sparked by Trump's tariff announcement on the 2nd of April this year. So let's take a look, a closer look at what the ONS has said today. So as you can see there, the growth is primarily driven by an increase in services and production, both of which have been in decline up to this point. And if you take a look here, that growth in services was concentrated in wholesale and retail trade, the motor industry, transport and admin services, and then there's a little bit in public services and health and social work. But we can see a dip there in education. Now, Reeves should milk this for all it's worth because it doesn't look like the good news will be lasting long. Consumer and business bills are forecast to go up, with hikes in water and energy bills and council tax. The unemployment rate is also at its highest in nearly 4 years, and with just the bare bones of a US-UK trade deal in place, the impact of Trump's tariffs are yet to take full effect. Indeed, the Bank of England somewhat rained on Reeves's parade, putting the growth spike down to, quote, erratic factors rather than structural economic strength. The Monetary Policy Committee, which sets interest rates, are forecasting a considerable slowdown of growth in the second quarter of the year, potentially plummeting to just 0.1%. And whilst inflation has slowed slightly from 2.8% in February to 2.5% in March, the Bank of England predicts an increase to 3.5% in the third quarter of 2025. So, to chat about what this all means for everyday people, I'm joined by the brilliant economist and distinguished policy fellow at the LSE, Faiza Shaheen. Hi, Faiza, how are you doing?
Yeah, all right. Just had bath time and have navigated with the baby. Stop crying by getting him to watch Miss Rachel, which is terrible on one level. I'm getting judged as a mother right now, but also, Miss Rachel is just the nicest person on the planet. So
no, you can do worse than Miss Rachel. You can do worse than Miss Rachel for sure. So, Faiza, can you unpack for us a little, what these figures tell us about both the kind of macroeconomic picture for the UK, but also what ordinary people are likely to experience in this kind of slight bump in GDP growth?
I'm old enough to remember when we had, 2% plus growth a year. And guess what? At that time, inequality was rising and many people across the country didn't see the impacts of that growth. So even if this isn't just a blip, which the data sort of tends to show us that it may well be, even if we see growth return to some sort of healthy figures, as the Treasury might put it, it is very unlikely that it's going to reach in particular, the sort of towns and cities and regions of this country that are economically depressed and have been so for some time. And that, linking to your last conversation, is politically a problem. A problem for Labour, but and just those of us that don't want this country taken over by reform. But that's something that reform was certainly play to. I remember during the Brexit discussions, Aditya Chakraborty at The Guardian had gone up north and he wrote this great article when someone was trying to say you should vote Remain because of GDP, and someone in the audience shouted out, "That's your GDP." And I think that sort of perfectly encapsulates like how people around the country can feel when they hear this, because on the one hand, yeah, you look at the sectors, often, there's more growth in London than the rest of the country, and that's building on already huge disparities. But also, even if you do get paid a little bit more, and there has been, for instance, an increase in the national living wage, bills have gone up massively in April, and people are often in some amount of debt, especially if you're on a minimum wage. And so that money anyway is kind of more than offset by your bills going up. So you don't actually feel any richer. So what the evidence tells us, that there was a period which I had lots of criticisms of this approach, but there was a period at least in which many rich countries were looking at inclusive growth. So they would say, not just growth, we've learned our lesson that growth on its own doesn't necessarily deliver for people. Let's have inclusive growth, which that language has gone from this Labour government, which is interesting. And what was learned through that, unless you're very, very active in your policies, it's actually very hard to get inclusive growth. It's very hard to get growth to address inequalities in your country, whether that be income or wealth or regional, often all of those things, unless you are really active and you put that as the kind of primary desire that you have, and you have to redistribute a lot. So that is why people aren't going to feel it, unless there's sort of a dramatic change in policy.
Yeah, and I think the point you make about the limitations of GDP, oh my gosh, I just come back from Egypt and now my P's are all B's. The limitations of GDP as a marker of growth or a marker of economic well-being. And I'll come on to that in a second. But before I do, you mentioned there this idea of inclusive growth. I mean, if that is possible, what kind of policy would we actually need to see growth in the economy not just be this abstract figure or, growth for the rich, but what would a policy or a set of policies that would enable that growth to actually be distributed through the population? What kind of what could that look like? What would have to change for that to be possible?
Yeah, I mean, typically the kind of shortcut way in which some countries do this is they take any proceeds from growth in terms of tax receipts and they redistribute that. So, things like getting rid of the 2-child benefit cap and not cutting disability benefits and putting more into raising minimum wages and putting more pressure on businesses if they are growing more to increase wages. And also in making sure that more go into sort of public services. But I think, and that, to be fair, is the sort of thing that Spain has done. But alongside that, you have to have these big industrial policies that actively think, okay, forget about London. What are we going to do to make sure that other parts of the UK, Nottinghamshire, not just the city, but the outer areas that heavily voted reform, how are those areas going to do something different, blossom? What kinds of jobs can we create, good jobs there? And so you have to have a very active industrial policy that is very much tilted towards those areas that need economic buoyancy to come back. So I think you really have to be active in doing that. And that's where sort of big green policies now, and this is the problem, and this is why what we're seeing right now isn't a structural change, because that kind of investment, this government is not willing to put forward.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, they're cutting the little that was there. So back to that kind of growth GDP question. This government has made growth its absolute number one priority. Do you think that is a viable goal?
I mean, it's really hard because there's just so many different factors happening in the world because of Trump. It might be that because the US is suddenly just seen as a no-go zone, that another English-speaking country like the UK suddenly does get lots of investment, or people that want to get out of the US, and we're seeing this in academia, are like come to the UK, and so they get all this kind of sort of high-paid, highly educated people come to the UK, and that boosts the economy. Although, I mean, we'll see, because they're being strict on immigration, that won't help the numbers that they're going for. But that might have a kind of knock-on benefit for a country like the UK. But again, that doesn't actually mean that people feel better off. Some people might, and actually the people already doing well might. And that could also result in lots of other consequences for, say, house prices. That doesn't mean that houses are going to be more affordable. So, it's difficult to predict that. There are some things that might even work in their favor. But one thing I can say, because we've learned this lesson so many times, is that growth does not equal happiness. It does not equal like wide-scale increases in well-being. And again, you have to have very active policies in terms of redistribution and in terms of investment if you're actually going to make these communities feel better off.
Yeah, it's almost by kind of abstracting it into this language of growth, you can skirt the question of like, am I going to be able to like live in stable, good housing, whether I rent it and I can rent it affordably, whether I own it and I can I have enough money to be able to buy it? Or, am I going to be able to afford like decent groceries? Can I afford to, spend money on like good food? Can I afford to take a break? Can I afford to take a holiday once in a while? When you abstract it into like GDP and growth and all of these abstract terms, policymakers can almost like skirt, or politicians can kind of skirt the actual concrete things that people want answers for. But if we move away from that kind of paradigm a little bit and go into the realm of imagination, which is very important to hold on to in these moments, I mean, there is obviously a stark lack of vision from all the major parties on economic policy. Unfortunately, we might have to start including reform in that category of major parties because, on the economy, reform is very aligned with this sort of growth-obsessed agenda. Many are saying that, we need a strong alternative proposal, possibly even a new vehicle or party for that. What do you make of those suggestions and what would an alternative look like to you?
Yeah, we definitely need to be putting forward ideas. And I just had this conversation with James Medway earlier on in the week, just saying we have to be careful in trying to kind of keep on top of all of the changes that are happening in global economic policy, that we're not just kind of day to day trying to make sense of it and not offering an alternative. And the thing that I would say is it's a lot of work done on like alternative measures to GDP. And I think that we should adopt things that aren't necessarily about the economy, but about the effects. So for instance, like I would look at child mental health as a way of measuring how society is doing, and measures of inequality and child poverty. So, I mean, I think we can be offering and looking in different ways and looking to countries where they are doing a much better job. One thing I would say about reform voters, and this is true of a lot of Labour voters too, they actually, putting aside some of the immigration views, they do support a lot of economic populist policies. So they do think that the rich don't pay enough. They do think that water should be in public ownership. They do think that the rich get away with, more than a working class person would. And so there is an opportunity there to push for redistribution, because that is somewhere where the public really do support, and sort of politicians, even Nigel Farage has had to kind of cave a bit on bringing steel into public ownership. So there is a push there, but we have to be careful that then isn't like combined with a anti-immigration narrative. And that we could get there. I mean, we could get to that place where there's a wealth tax, but also we'll use that wealth tax to spend for defense spending, and we'll still be anti-immigration.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is kind of the really difficult political line to kind of balance now. But Faiza, thank you so much for joining us. And you get back to your baby, because it's a cute ass baby. The cutest baby.
Thank you so much. Nice to see you.
The UK has been aiding Israel in its genocide on Gaza by providing intelligence reports to the Israeli government. That's the claim that's been repeatedly made by investigators at Declassified UK, who recorded at least 500 British intelligence flights over Gaza since Israel's assault on the Strip began 19 months ago. According to the government, the flights are there to aid Israel in recovering hostages. But now one government minister seems to have let slip that the support does go a lot deeper than that. The British Museum hosted a celebration of Israel's Independence Day on Tuesday night. It's worth saying, of course, that Israel's independence is equivalent to the displacement and dispossession of millions of Palestinians, known as the Nakba, which is marked just 2 days later. And I'm not sure a cultural institution like the British Museum should be celebrating that, though I guess it's no surprise to see a party for colonialism happening at a venue famous for having stolen its treasures from every country the British ever set foot in. But I digress. One of the speakers at that event was Defence Minister Maria Eagle. Eagle is a member of Labour Friends of Israel, so who better to stand shoulder to shoulder with her genocidal besties, including Israeli ambassador to the UK, Tzipi Hotovely, and celebrate the birth of the State of Israel on the very night it killed over 70 Palestinians in bombing raids across Gaza. This is part of Eagle's speech.
As a long-standing friend and partner, it's been hard over the last couple of years to see Israel going through some of the most difficult times in its history. The appalling, unconscionable attacks on the 7th of October are still seared into our minds. the UK stood with Israel, with the RAF conducting surveillance flights over the eastern Mediterranean in support of hostage rescue efforts. We stood with Israel when Iran launched its reckless, coordinated missile and drone attacks, with RAF aircraft intercepting a number of them. And we continue to stand with Israel today, supporting her right to security and the right of all Israelis to live free from fear and violence.
Don't try and tell me that with all that adoring, gushing love for Israel expressed there, that our government is flying planes over Gaza just for the hostages. Igor was very clear. The UK is there, as she said in her own words, supporting Israel's so-called right to security, no matter what that means for the Palestinians. And the UK is there, as Igor also said, supporting the right of all Israelis to live free from fear and violence. Not Palestinians, though. Fear and violence is all they get, while our government ministers throw parties for the people causing it. Kieran, history is not going to look kindly on that clip, is it?
No, it's an exhibit. I mean, it's going to be, I have to believe, and I think we can all work in this direction. It's going to be a piece of evidence, I hope, one day. And all of these people parading their proud, effusive support of Israel, and in so doing, letting too much slip, will, I hope, one day realise that that was the worst decision that they ever made. The problem is, of course, that I think for them is they've lived through the second greatest war crime of the 21st century, which is to say, in my view, at least, I'm happy, obviously, for people to disagree because it killed more people, but the war in Iraq. And they lived through the war in Iraq. We've lived through the war in Iraq, and we've seen total impunity for all of it, no culpability whatsoever imposed upon the people who orchestrated and were the architects of that war crime. And so they also believe that they can act with total impunity. The pretentious term is raison d'etat, reason of state, and that will always protect them in law. That they'll always be protected by, well, I was doing what was in the national interest at the time, and we had a mandate to do it because of the government of the day, etc., etc. But of course, the ICC, to its shame, didn't put out arrest warrants for Tony Blair and George W. Bush. It has put out arrest warrants, to its credit, for Netanyahu and Gallant, and I suspect many others further down the line. So I can't work out where hope ends and genuine belief, empirically grounded belief begins. But somewhere between those two, I have a strong sense that Maria Igor, everybody else that has been publicly endorsing what Israel's doing and then privately backing it through very real, material, concrete measures like sending surveillance flights, etc., to Gaza so that Israel can target children en masse, because that's what they're doing. I mean, that's what it's doing. We know Israel's doing that. That's almost a cliche to say that at this point. Of course, we know that's what they're doing. But that's what those surveillance flights must be aware that they're doing. They must be aware. They see the same news we see. They must be aware that they are essentially giving Israel the coordinates to carry out mass infanticide. So I don't know how these people sleep at night. They inhabit a different moral universe to the likes of you and I, Dalia, and everyone we know, I suspect. But fuck that. Forget how they sleep. I don't give a shit how they sleep. I'm more interested in making sure we nail the bastards and that eventually, even if it takes the rest of our lives, they end up in some kind of dock.
Yeah, I mean, I know that history is going to condemn these people. The question is what will be lost before that happens. That's the only thing that I'm uncertain of. So I'm going to leave you with a slightly more, let me say, satisfying sight. The Israeli party was hosted by comedian and one-time tax avoider Jimmy Carr, and whilst he seems to have happily taken a check from genocide heirs, Carr appeared a little less comfortable admitting it.
Jimmy, Jimmy, were you hosting the event? Jimmy, turn around.
Now, because I host events that I'm normally proud of, and I am always proud of, and that align with my values, if someone asks me when I walk out of that event, Dalia, were you hosting that event? I say, yeah, sure, let's talk about it. But that tells me that deep down, Jimmy Carr knows that he's a piece of shit. Sorry, don't want to get it. Let me just slip that one under the radar. Now, I'm not a fan of George Galloway, but it's hard not to agree with this assessment of the comic. He tweeted, "Revolting little shit." Way with words. He's an orator, isn't he? Above all else. Right. At Novara Media, we've worked really hard to bring you the most truthful, in-depth and unflinching analysis and reporting on Israel's genocide in Gaza. That work is now being recognised, with Novara Media's Ash Sarkar and Michael Walker being jointly shortlisted for the Amnesty People's Choice Award for their journalism. Now you get to vote for the winner, and we'd like you to vote for us. All you have to do is go to amnesty.org.uk/castyourvote. That link is also in the description below, and feel free to spread the word. Ben Cohen, i.e. the Ben in Ben & Jerry's ice cream, was one of 7 people arrested for protesting during US Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s testimony before a Senate committee. Here's a clip from the protest.
Permitted while the committee conducts its business. Capitol Police are asked to remove the individuals from the hearing room.
Move down the hallway.
Ben, why are you getting arrested?
Move down the hallway. If you stop, you will be arrested.
Poor kids in Gaza by buying bombs and pays for it by kicking kids off Medicaid in the U.S.
Keep going down. Keep going down the hallway.
Ben, how many days have they been starving in Gaza?
What has it been? 75 days by now. Stop.
Anthony, I need my shoe.
Our program.
We work down the hall right now. Let's go. Everybody. I'm saying, everybody. Stop this. Pick it up. Stop business. Pick it up.
Ben, what are you calling for the Congress and senators to do for Gaza?
Congress and the senators need to ease the siege. They need to let food into Gaza. They need to let food into starving kids.
What did you say in there, man?
I said that Congress is paying to bomb poor kids in Gaza and paying for it by kicking poor kids off Medicaid in the U.S.
So you can see Cohen there, who is the older gentleman with white hair, being dragged out of the hearing in handcuffs. He's protesting the ongoing military aid being sent by the US to Israel, which is currently conducting a genocidal assault in the Gaza Strip. Speaking about his protest, Cohen said this in an interview with Chris Cuomo.
What's happening in Gaza is horrible. They just agreed to restart the aid, and I've been critical of the stopping of aid and how necessary it is. But don't you have to give some space for the fact that Hamas, a terror organization, is still holding 6 people just about, and that they need to give them back if they want to have high ground, don't they?
Yes, the hostages need to be returned, but that's no justification to kill tens of thousands of children, old people, mothers, fathers, people just like us.
Well, just like us, some, yes. Others are aligned with a terror organization. I'm not talking about the kids. I'm talking about the people who are on the ground, who are adults in Gaza. And if it were America and they had 59 of our people and they were a terror organization, do you think the United States would be doing anything different than Israel is?
Boy, I would hope they'd be doing something different, because what's going on in Israel right now is genocide with our bombs. The American people have become complicit in the genocide that Israel is engaging in. And if it weren't for us providing the bombs, they wouldn't be able to do it.
Well, they have a lot of their own weapons. You know that, Ben. I know you're very sophisticated about this stuff. But don't you believe that genocide, obviously there's a legal standard, but do you target things? Do you avoid things? Do you pace things? Do you allow any aid the way Israel has if it's really a genocide? We've seen what that looks like in other situations. It doesn't look like this.
Boy, it sure looks like it to me. I mean, they're Let me think. All the hospitals have been destroyed. All the universities have been destroyed. The schools have been destroyed. The housing has been destroyed. And tens of thousands of people have been killed.
I mean, so many things in that interview. First of all, people, Ben says these people just like us, these Palestinians who are being killed by these weapons that our government is paying for, they're just like us. And Chris Cuomo can't help himself. He goes, some of them are just like us. And then he goes, I'm not talking about the kids, I'm talking about the adults. So implicitly there, it's like, what? So if you're a Palestinian adult living in Gaza, you're not just like us. You're not someone who has brothers, sisters, parents, children, like hopes, dreams, a life. Like this kind of language creates this carte blanche to basically say that Palestinian adults who don't have the plausible innocence of a child are guilty until proven innocent. And normally they're going to be proven innocent after they've been bombed. Also, Ben points out, like, this is a genocidal assault. And then they have this kind of textbook answer. People who are trying to sort of defend what Israel is doing. And they say, well, because of this kind of like, they let in this like little piece of bread on Tuesday, the 23rd of this month, blah, blah, blah. So, they wouldn't do that if it was a genocide. I'm like, sorry, but the ICJ, which is a court that has seen, that actually has, whose job it is to define to prosecute genocide, and has seen all of the evidence, and where people who are experts on this topic have seen evidence that I haven't seen, most of us haven't seen, are saying there is a plausible risk of genocide here. And that is the furthest that the ICJ can go at this stage, because it takes years and years and years to firmly say that this is a genocide. It's unfortunately the process is far too long. But the idea that Chris Cuomo can just sit there in his armchair and say, well, I don't think it is because of this news report that I've heard somewhere, that he thinks that he knows better, that he can have a better assessment on whether or not this is a genocide than a court that is literally set up to adjudicate whether or not something is a genocide. I mean, for me, look, obviously I have my own position on what Israel has been doing to Palestine now for over 70 years, nearly 100 years. But even if you want to position yourself as some kind of neutral outsider, which is absurd, but even if you do want to do that, you can't take the ICJ at their word. On what basis can you not take them at their word? Now, obviously, Israel has long been the largest recipient of US military aid, which is what Ben Cohen was protesting there. And this has only increased since Israel began its war in Gaza over a year ago. So this graph from the Council on Foreign Relations shows a consistently high level of military aid per year, going all the way back to 1970, with billions being sent annually when adjusted for inflation. And you can see there a huge hike at the end from $3.9 billion in 2023 to $12.5 billion in 2024. And since taking office, Trump has already approved nearly $12 billion in foreign military sales to Israel. With the aid of this spending, Israel has, in this war alone, killed at least 61,000 Palestinians in Gaza, including more than 17,000 children, injured over 100,000, and left at least 14,000 trapped under the rubble. Ben & Jerry's have been one of the only major American corporations to call out the US's enabling of Israel's genocide attack on Gaza. And back in 2021, the company announced it would no longer allow its Israeli licensee to sell its ice cream in the West Bank and Gaza. The move was blocked a year later by a US judge, forcing the company to roll back on the policy. Now, obviously, one of the things that Ben was really emphasizing there is that the US state is taking money out of Medicaid for children in the US and using it to bomb children in Palestine. And, it goes without saying that even if Medicaid was absolutely thriving, even if, public services in the West were absolutely thriving, that would not justify sending billions of dollars to a country that is at plausible risk of, according to the ICJ, of conducting a genocide in Palestine. But it is an important and profound point there to bring up that these administrations, the Trump administration, the state, are not interested in protecting lives that it doesn't see as valuable. One of those categories are Palestinian lives. Another category is poor lives. And that's why we are seeing in tandem the same government that is signing off these outrageous numbers in military aid to Israel are also cutting Medicaid from the poorest children, from the poorest people in their own countries. It's a shared ideology. And that's what that protest, I think, quite profoundly emphasized. Thanks for joining me today, Kieran. What's your favorite Ben & Jerry's ice cream? What are you going to tuck into tonight?
I'm glad you asked. Well, just quickly to say on all of that, I know we've run out of time, but it's nice to see that, I'm a guilty consumer of things sometimes. I think we all are, if we're honest with ourselves. And it's nice to see that all of those pots of cookie dough consumed throughout my teenage years, at least the money didn't go to the very worst of the rich and powerful. And next stop, I hope, for Ben & Jerry's, full on BDS. Thank you. It's been an emotional day. It's been an emotional show, actually. And thanks for hosting it, Dalia. And thanks to everybody who's listened and watched.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.